Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be wrapping up a short series I've been doing on classical versus non-classical approaches to apologetics for Christianity, and also using that to make a kind of transition into what I want to discuss in the next couple of weeks. So for the last several weeks, I've been approaching the classical idea, which I don't agree with, that we must argue for theism before we present a historical argument for Jesus' resurrection. And the must there is supposed to have an epistemological meaning, not just a sociological, psychological, or interpersonal meaning for some particular audience. And that's important. And I've been, separating those two and explicitly saying certainly that it could be helpful psychologically, rhetorically, to argue for theism first with certain audiences. But it is not an epistemological necessity. And I made the analogy of pouring water from two different sources into a measuring cup in the middle, and the measurement is going to be the same in the end, regardless of what order you pour in. So the other thing I've been doing is talking about what might be considered to raise the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection and how that would work. Because part of what the classical approach is doing is focusing on that prior probability and saying if the prior probability is, quote unquote, too low, we're not going to have a convincing argument for Jesus' resurrection. There's an interesting sort of overlap there between classical approaches and minimal facts or minimalist or core facts approaches. I'm not saying that everyone who holds to the one holds to the other, not at all, but there's a kind of interesting sort of psychological overlap, because if you're doing a minimalist approach, your argument isn't going to be as strong as if you're doing a maximalist approach. And so it's maybe more understandable that you might think we got to raise the prior, because if the prior is too low, we're not going to have a strong enough argument for Jesus' resurrection. And the maximalist is saying, speak for yourself, because we think our argument for the resurrection just is stronger and can overcome a lower prior probability. But I've never seen anyone prior to this series of mine talk about classicism in this way, and the way that different things that might be called the religious context of Jesus' ministry actually function in setting the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection. So you can watch the previous videos to see what I did there. I'm not going to recap that here. Today, I want to talk about another type of argument that I think is sometimes in the back or the front of the classicist's mind, and you do see this stated. And the idea here is that there is what I would call a worldview impasse between the theist and the atheist, especially like a modern naturalist who doesn't even, believe in the supernatural at all, when it comes to approaching the Gospels. Now, this, again, especially can be brought up against the maximalists like me, where I say we should be looking at the Gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection and arguing at least that they came from people who were in a position to know, and that this is what the original alleged witnesses actually claimed. Then we can evaluate that. And we get there by talking about arguments for the reliability of the Gospels, and that the authors are not including embellished resurrection accounts where somebody made up the bit about Jesus eating fish or whatever for an apologetic reason, and it got included in the Gospel, but rather that this is really what the original witnesses claimed. Now, somebody who's pushing this notion of a worldview impasse can say, well, you maximalists are asking the skeptic to accept a holistic evaluation of the Gospels as documents, like the Gospel of John as a document. Does it appear to be highly reliable? Does it appear to come from people in a position to know? who get their facts right, who are careful, etc. But the skeptic is going to say, fine, I will evaluate the Gospel of John or Luke or Matthew or Mark holistically from my perspective as a naturalist skeptic, and I'm going to say, well, they contain miracles, so they're lousy. They're not reliable just because they contain miracles. So then the classicalist can use that as an argument for the need to argue for theism first, because the classicist can say, all the more so if you are a maximalist and you want to use the gospel resurrection accounts and say that they're not embellishments and so forth, then you'd better argue for theism first, because otherwise you're just going to be at a worldview impasse with your skeptical audience. This could even be pushed farther, that the skeptic might try to say, well, you're asking me to accept something that I don't accept, namely that miracles do sometimes occur, in order to give a holistic evaluation of the Gospels and not just dismiss them out of hand. And why should I do that? And then the theist says, well, you're asking me to grant something that I don't grant, namely that miracles never happen, and that's not fair either. And so then there's this impasse. And then the classicalist can say, well, you're going to break that impasse by coming in with, I don't know, the cosmological argument, or the moral argument, or the argument from mind, biological design argument, whatever these other arguments are for theism. Or arguments from the religious context of Jesus' ministry, so that you can break that impasse where each side is claiming that the other is begging the question. Now, I don't deny that you could do that, but I think it's very important for us to keep clear in our minds whether something is a real epistemological necessity. And I think if a skeptic did try to say that there is a worldview impasse of that kind, in an epistemological sense, not just, that that's how he feels or whatever, and he's not going to bother, but in a real epistemological sense, he's wrong. And we need to recognize that he is wrong, and that it is possible to ask the skeptic, and legitimate to ask the skeptic, to evaluate the Gospels holistically, and not just to dismiss them out of hand on the grounds that they contain miracles. And in asking him to do that, we are not asking him to abandon his skepticism a priori, which would obviously be question begging on our side. Now, the first thing one can say about a skeptic who says he's just going to dismiss the Gospels out of hand is that there is a kind of closed-mindedness to this, and a kind of circularity. C.S. Lewis pointed this out many years ago, that, the skeptic says there's never been a credible account of a miracle. And then we bring up the Gospels and he says, well, that's not credible because it reports a miracle. I mean, that's just a very obvious and rather small circular argument. We can say that. That's legitimate. That's true. It is. But I think we can do even more than that. We can do better than that. It is completely legitimate to ask the skeptic to bracket the concern about miracles. Now, I want to be clear. Bracketing and granting for the sake of the argument are not the same thing. And this is something that was pointed out several years ago by my friend Tom Gilson when we were talking about minimalism. He said, yeah, the minimalist shouldn't grant for the sake of the argument that the Gospels are unreliable, but maybe what the minimalist really means to say is, bracketing that question. I don't think you can bracket it either, but the point is it's correct that bracketing is not the same as granting something contrary to what you believe, even for the sake of the argument. So when we ask the skeptic to bracket the concern that he has about miracles, what we're doing is we're saying, let's talk about some other lines of evidence for or even against the reliability of the Gospels that don't immediately require us to decide whether miracles can happen or not. In other words, if we're investigating, for example, if there are real contradictions in the Gospels, and this could pertain to all kinds of things, not even miracles, but about what Jesus said or what Jesus did, when did Jesus cleanse the temple, etc. And we're talking about whether harmonizing those accounts is legitimate historically or not. We're not arguing about whether miracles can occur at that point. We're arguing about an approach to history, which I would say is legitimate in secular history and important in secular history as well, to be willing to harmonize accounts. Do the same broad type of events happen more than once, like the temple cleansing? Yes, they often do. So there's no, contradiction here concerning when Jesus cleansed the temple. So arguments from contradiction and replies to those are actually things that we can consider without deciding on whether miracles occur. Evidences for the Gospels are often of this same kind. Many undesigned coincidences, and even undesigned coincidences that surround a miracle account, as in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, you can note the undesigned coincidence without deciding definitely that the feeding of the 5,000 took place. I mean, it's going to push you, right? But there's this event, called the event X, and it took place outdoors, and they're saying that, it happened and there was green grass, and this other account is saying that it was near the time of Passover, or in the lead up to this event, call it X. Jesus was talking with Philip, and Philip was from Bethsaida. So those kinds of things are not question-begging when we ask the skeptic to acknowledge their force. The same thing with all kinds of little customs and so forth that are correct in the Gospels, and even more so in Acts over an even wider geographical span. Again, coupled with asking the skeptic to recognize the very real difficulty of just going to a library and looking it up, which I've had some people bring up, which is just really poor understanding of the history of the time. What do all of these things have in common? What they have in common is that we're asking the skeptic to develop good historical methodologies and historical common sense and apply those fairly to the Gospels. And that's legitimate to ask of anyone. It's not in any way begging the question in favor of the occurrence of miracles. If that is in place, I believe that it supports the conclusion that the resurrection accounts, it very strongly, I think, supports the conclusion that the resurrection accounts represent what original alleged witnesses were claiming in detail about what happened. And then that goes on into a further maximalist argument for the resurrection. Again, no questions are begged at that point. And therefore, there should not be such a worldview impasse. That is another way to break the alleged worldview impasse. And in a sense, what that is going to do is create cognitive dissonance for someone who completely dismisses miracles. Because he's going to say, well, I've been completely dismissing miracles, and you hear these accounts that occur in documents that appear credible in all of these ways and appear to come from people who were present and at what they allege to have happened, and tell us what they actually claimed. And, that would be a pretty strong argument for Jesus' resurrection. Again, as we've noticed before, with that water pouring, evidence for Jesus' resurrection is evidence for theism, because it's evidence that a miracle took place. So then, the naturalist or skeptic has to think about all of that and try to pour all the water into the middle cup and get a fair evaluation of the evidence taken as a whole. Another point that I just want to make in closing here is that type of sensible historical approach that we can completely fairly request the atheist to take is also not something you're going to be able to avoid indefinitely. In order for the atheist to become a Christian with Christian doctrine and so forth, in a way that is supported by evidence, he's going to need access to what Jesus taught, for example. And unfortunately, aside from an anti-supernatural bias, there is a lot of lack of common sense. There is very little common sense in biblical studies, and I've especially seen it in New Testament studies because that's where I've most done my research, and even among people who are Christians who therefore don't have an anti-supernatural bias. So even if you take some kind of a classical approach and you argue for theism, that raises the prior probability, then you do some kind of maybe even a minimalist argument for the resurrection, which I still don't think should take it to, over 0.5, even if someone is a theist, but that's my argument against minimalism. But you think you've gotten this person to the point where he believes that Jesus rose from the dead, whether that was by a compelling set of arguments or just something he found compelling. Okay, you've put off as long as possible asking him to evaluate the Gospels holistically. You're not going to be able to put that off indefinitely. Because, unfortunately, there are plenty of theists and even Christians walking around out there who don't have good methodology in evaluating the New Testament documents, and it shows. And in that way, they are cutting themselves off from a rational defense, a strong evidential defense of Christian doctrine. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. I won't be necessarily talking about classical and evidential approaches anymore, but that's my transition. Evaluating things historically, sensibly, reasonably, in a holistic way is not question begging. It's legitimate to ask even a skeptic to do, and in the end, it is necessary to ask even a Christian to do. So, you might as well do that at any time. I hope you found this interesting. Please like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel. You can also get this content, in case you didn't know, on Anchor FM, the Lydia McGrew podcast, if you prefer listening to old episodes, maybe while you're doing something else rather than watching videos. So, thanks for watching or listening. I'm Lydia McGrew.